So let's take a look at something called variables here. Now, with computers, variables are really important. Now, variables are little pieces of data that you can either store pieces of data in or you can manipulate them. So if I were to take something off the top of my head, if you wanted to have a calculator adding in, let's say, two numbers, you would have a variable for the first number and a variable for the second number, as well as a variable for the answer. Okay, you can store that information in there. And it's really something that is a good concept that you need to understand when it comes to computers. Storing data in variables is extremely important. Now, in Xcode and SpriteKit, you'll find that you'll make a lot of variables, and especially with games and the SpriteKit, you'll find that you'll make way more variables than you think are necessary for a game. In fact, it'll probably be 5 times as many. So when you make a game, you want to make sure that you are adding in all like the colors, the sizes of all the game objects. We can have a lot of game state variables. We can add in a whole bunch of different kinds of variables. With apps, again, you are going to add in variables as such like that are necessary for the app to work with, as well as, for example, like has in-app purchase or is completed in-app purchase or something like that, or is connected to the internet. There's a lot of different kinds of variables we can use. All right, so how do we go and declare a variable? Well, you see we have one here, and this is a variable, and it is an str, or string. So let's go ahead and let's delete that here. In order to make a variable work, you need to say var, and then the variable name here. And one thing that I like to mention is you can see that variable name, the first word isn't capitalized, but the second one is. This is one of the best practices of any coding language. And the reason why we do this is that it's easier to understand variable name versus variable name. Okay, you can see that it looks a lot better. You're more than welcome to try it. Now, it's not necessarily mandatory that you do this, but believe it or not, what can cause a program to not get released to the public is sloppy variable names, sloppy coding practices. It's happened to me, and I don't want it to happen to you. So make your code look neat. Now, Swift is something that's very new, and it's added in something new where you don't have to declare the variable type. In this case, we are declaring this variable of type string. Now, a string variable is characters like this, right? So let's just say and take a look at this here. So the variable name here in this case is Mammoth Interactive, and it's a string variable. It's not a number variable, it's a string variable. You must ask, is there such a thing as number variables? Well, there's a lot of different kinds of number variables. And when it comes to Swift and Xcode, there are different kinds of string variables, there's different kinds of number variables, and you want to think of them as similar kinds of fruits. So if you have, let's say, two different kinds of string variables, they are kind of like apples, red apples and green apples. You can't mix them together, and we'll be talking about that very shortly. But let's take a look at some int, and we'll make that equal to 1. So some int, which stands for integer, and it's a counting number, and it can be a negative number, it can be 0, it can be as long as it's a counting number. There are no decimals here. All right. So you usually use integers for counting numbers. So if you're not using decimals, then you use integers. Let's add in some double. All right. And let's make this 2.3. So this is a double variable, and it's 2.3. Now, there are different kinds of variables that have decimals. So there's a double, and there's a var sum float is equal to negative, I'll make it equal to 5 point whatever. It doesn't really matter what it is. Now here's the issue. Automatically, if you don't add in a decimal, it becomes an integer. Now again, an integer is a type of variable. Think of it like a type of fruit. You have a double, and if you add in a decimal, it automatically becomes a double. And you want to think of it as a variable that has decimals. Even though a float variable is like a double, but it's slightly different. And if you want it to be a float, you have to add in a colon and type in float. Okay, and this is a good way to think of this. You can see that there's a float, there's a 32-bit float, and there's an 80 float, and there's also all these different kinds of floats. And by the way, float is short for floating point, and now you can see that it is a float. Likewise, you can do this with every variable. You can make it an integer, and you can see that there's all these different kinds of integers. And when you get into Xcode, you will have to convert sometimes int 32 to a regular integer. Again, this is like two apples, right? In Swift's world, you cannot, for example, add an integer and an int 32 together. They do not mix, all right? And we'll talk about that. So we have an integer here, and this will also be a double, all right? Now, something that's really important is we could say some CG float and make that a CG float. Make it equal to 0 point whatever. All right, so you can see here that we have a double and a float and a CG float. Okay, there are different kinds of floats. And Xcode is very particular about the data. You can't add in, you can only add in two doubles together. You can add in two integers together. You can divide two integers together, but you can't add an integer and a double, all right? Now there's one other type of variable that's really important here, and it's a Boolean variable. We'll call this sum bool. Make that equal to true. Now, Booleans are either true or false. They are kind of like a light switch. It's either on or off. Now, this is really important. For example, I could add in some Booleans saying something along the lines of, you know, has bought in-app purchase, or if you're into games, is alive, or has fireball, something like that. You can see that there are it's either on or off. You know, for example, can, and one that's really important is connected to internet, like that. It's up to you whether you want to do that or not here. So these are a lot of the kinds of variables that we work with Swift. And let's take a look at how we can go and do a little bit of work with Swift. And I'll show you how to do that in the next tutorial.